Okay, it's on. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yay, okay. Just to be clear, it was Paris's fault that I missed my flight. The passport line was really long, and I don't know, they just didn't want to wait for me. So as mentioned, I'm Eileen Uchitelle. You can find me anywhere online at the handle Eileen Codes, so that's Twitter, GitHub, my blog that I never write in, and my email. I'm an engineer at GitHub. I work on the Ruby architecture team, where our team is responsible for looking at how our application can work better with Rails and Ruby and how Rails and Ruby can support our application. We set standards, we consult on other projects, we assess the existing system, all of that good stuff, which is really just code for working on technical debt. I'm on the Rails core team. For those of you who are not that familiar with how the Rails team runs stuff, the core team is responsible for the future of the framework. We decide what's going to go into the next release, when to release, and all of that good stuff that goes along with releasing. So each year I reflect back on what I've learned, what work I've been doing, and what I'd like to share with you all at upcoming conferences. When I started writing the abstract for this talk, I originally thought that I wanted to talk about the intimate details of upgrading Rails at GitHub. I had spent a year and a half upgrading GitHub from Rails 3.2 to 5.2, and I certainly could talk about it for hours, maybe even days, until you were all bored. As I started to explore the themes around upgrading, I realized that there was a deeper story that I wanted to explore. I started wondering, how did we end up so far behind Rails master in the first place? What decisions did we make that caused the upgrade to be so much more difficult than it should have been? What drove us to upgrade when we were so far behind? And what does the future look like now that we're actually tracking Rails master? So the story that I want to tell you is the story of the past, present, and future of Rails at GitHub. We've been using Rails at GitHub since day one, and at times Rails and GitHub have had our differences. Many years ago, we forked Rails and practically wrote our own version. We fought against the framework, we deviated from the framework, and we even wondered if Rails was right for us at all. But at the end of the day, GitHub is successful because of Rails, and Rails is successful because of GitHub. Our upgrade didn't just make for a good blog post for Hacker News to criticize. The upgrade made it possible for us to use and invest in Rails for the long haul. We can change and influence the framework for our needs while also benefiting the broader Rails community and open source ecosystem. This story is part historical. We'll look back at the beginning and how GitHub ended up maintaining a custom fork of Rails 2. It's also part technical, exploring what compelled us to upgrade our process and why it was so difficult. We'll look at the costs of not upgrading and how technical debt accumulates in your application until it starts working against your framework. Lastly, this story is part forward-looking. We'll dive into our effort at GitHub to clean up technical debt, our commitment to open source, and our responsibility to support Rails for the long haul. Let's go back in time to the beginning. In 2004, DHH announced a new Ruby framework called Ruby on Rails. Immediately, Rails caught the attention of the Ruby community. At RubyConf that year, DHH talked about Rails' history, how it came to be, and of course, why it was better than existing Ruby frameworks. He went on to talk about his philosophy in building the framework, most notably that many frameworks fail because they're built without an application in mind. He said that frameworks are retrospectives. They should be extracted, not built. Rails was attractive and successful because it was extracted from a real application, Basecamp. In the early years, Rails complexity grew slowly, and Rails 1.0 was released in December of 2005. 2 years later, Rails 1.2 was released. That same year, Tom Preston Warner was at a Ruby meetup in San Francisco when he showed his friend Chris Rainsrath a tool called Grit. Grit was a Ruby tool that allowed you to view Git repositories in an object-oriented way and would become the basis for Git repos on GitHub. After seeing Grit, Chris was immediately hooked, and a few days later, the GitHub Rails application was born. GitHub was created using Rails 1.2.3 and after a short beta, GitHub was launched to the public in April of 2008. The next day, Rails moved from their own SVN server to GitHub. In 2009, Rails 2.3 was released. In the early days, when Rails would release a new version, GitHub would quickly upgrade to get new features and bug fixes. But sometime between 2008 and 2009, GitHub had forked Rails. I couldn't find an exact date because we vendor our gems at GitHub, and there weren't any commits that made it clear exactly when we forked. Personally, I had always thought that we forked GitHub in Rails 3.0 because it was very slow. Slow enough that many applications couldn't upgrade. But it turns out that had nothing to do with why we forked Rails, and it was long before we even knew 3.0 was a problem. Now remember, this was the wild west of Rails startups. No one really knew what the future of Rails or GitHub was going to be. We weren't yet really talking about the importance of upgrading or staying current with Rails Master. And frankly, Rails wasn't as stable as it is these days. I don't want to go as far as to say that Rails didn't care about performance at this time, but I know that many app developers felt that way. It definitely wasn't a concern the way it is now. Maybe that's because we were all kind of inexperienced back then, or maybe it was because Rails was good enough for its most important user, Basecamp. Maybe it was because we, GitHub, didn't contribute enough upstream. I'm not criticizing the past, but it's important to examine why we ended up here so that we can learn for the future. The real problem was that GitHub didn't just fork Rails and add a bug fix here or a performance improvement there. It wasn't just backports from upstream on the fork. No, GitHub's fork was Rails with custom code just for GitHub. It was Rails morphed into a different framework that was built for GitHub the way Rails was built for Basecamp. As GitHub doubled down on their fork and added more and more functionality, Rails continued to progress at a fast pace as well. At this time, nobody could predict or understand the cost that forking Rails would have on GitHub's application or engineering team. In 2010, Rails 3.0 was released, but many applications couldn't upgrade due to the performance concerns that I mentioned earlier. The performance issues in Rails 3.0 were a really big deal. Users saw an unacceptable increase in response times, some applications seeing request times taking as much as twice as long. Active record in Rails 3 was found to be 5 times slower than Rails 2. Despite knowing about performance concerns, an engineer at GitHub, Aman Gupta, also known as TMM1, started work on upgrading GitHub from Rails 3 to Rails 3 and Ruby 1.9. GitHub hadn't just forked Rails, we forked Ruby 2, which made our upgrades even more difficult. The Rails 3 upgrade wasn't pointing at Rails 3 upstream either. It was still a fork of Rails 3 with custom patches added on top. From experience, I can tell you that maintaining a fork while trying to upgrade and then add all the new stuff that you added to that old version on top of your new version is enough to make one want to quit programming, and I don't recommend it. In 2012, Rails 3.2 was released, and most of the performance concerns have been fixed by Aaron Patterson and other contributors. In the same year that performance issues were fixed, GitHub's progress on the Rails upgrade stalled. It had been 2 years since they started the 3.0 upgrade, and the engineering team began questioning whether the effort was worth it at all. They asked each other, why upgrade when this version isn't causing us pain? Why upgrade when Rails 3.0 just isn't that great? Why upgrade when our fork has more features? Looking at these questions, the engineering team decided the upgrade wasn't worth their time and focused their attention on other projects. The truth is that at this time, GitHub wasn't yet feeling the pain of being on a fork of Rails. And it's really difficult to convince a team to upgrade when they're still feeling productive. You make your tests faster when they feel too slow. You refactor complexity of that class when you need to add functionality. But when do you upgrade? What's the incentive if the new version isn't better and your fork is working just fine? If you're not feeling the pain of being on a fork or an old version, you're not going to be compelled to upgrade. Eventually, all of these why should we upgrade questions would become suffocating for the engineering team. It became harder and harder to find where the framework ended and the application began as GitHub engineers started to fight against the fork and the application. Security backports were a nightmare. Each time Rails announced a security vulnerability, GitHub was forced to manually patch that vulnerability in their fork. Hiring was becoming increasingly difficult. Nobody wanted to work on a Rails 2.3 application that doesn't even resemble Rails 2. It's harder to get up to speed, and you can't Google search how to do anything. Dependencies were brittle and unsupported as Gem authors focused on new versions of Rails. Development was slow and painful. Working with an application that's tied so heavily to a custom fork can make adding features or refactoring code increasingly difficult. We realized we had to get off a fork, or that fork was going to suffocate the application. In 2014, a team of 4 full-time engineers and a few volunteers banded together, wrote an upgrade plan, and got to work. It took the team 6 months of full-time coordinated effort to deploy Rails 3.0 to production, and a few months later, they deployed Rails 3.2 as well. It's important to remember here that 3.0 and 3.2 are still a fork of Rails with custom GitHub patches added on top. By this time, the Rails 3 series was only receiving security patches, so even though the upgrade was a success, the fork was still very far behind. The effort to put into upgrading from 3.3 to 3.2 was massive, and the motivation dwindled after that. It would be another 2 years before the 4.0 upgrade was started. That same year, Rails 5.0 came out. I'm sure to some it felt like GitHub was just never going to catch up if Rails was constantly releasing new versions and GitHub was still so far behind. In 2017, I joined GitHub. At this point, the Rails 4.0 upgrade just wasn't in a good place. There was no dedicated team working on it, and the upgrade had fallen by the wayside. On my first day, I asked Hubot to run the Rails 4.0 tests and saw that there were over 4,000 failures. Luckily, Hubot can't count, and the number was more like 2,500. Really easy, right? After the 3.0 upgrade, GitHub engineers had at least added some tooling to help make Rails upgrades easier. We had a system that allows us to dual boot the application in multiple Rails versions. This means that we don't need to maintain long-running upgrade branches. By adding the ability to dual boot, we can focus only on test failures instead of merge conflicts. Unfortunately, this method also requires us to hack Bundler, but I'd rather hack Bundler than use a fork of Rails. With this method, we were able to boot the application server console and run tests in multiple Rails versions, which makes it easy to compare and contrast behavior between the version that you're using in production and the version that you're trying to upgrade to. This process allows us to incrementally upgrade Rails and prevent regressions once we have an upgraded version. So for example, when the Rails 4.0 build was green, everyone had to write code that worked in 3.2 and 4.0. Once we got the 4.1 build green, everyone had to write code that passed in 3.2 and 4.1, and we continued that process until we got to 5.2. Now we do 5.2 and 6.0. In the application code, we use helper methods that easily allows us to condition for different Rails versions. We always put the production version in the if clause and the future code in the else. That way, when we upgrade to 4.2, we don't fall into the 3.2 code path, we fall into the else code path. In March of 2018, a year and 3 months after I started at GitHub, we deployed 4.2 to production with 0 downtime and no customer impact. After deploying 4.2 to production, I wanted to get started on 5.0 right away because I didn't want what happened to the 4.0 upgrade to happen to the 5 upgrade. But I was really honestly very burned out. I felt like this Mac over here, or like a blue screen of death. I had been the only engineer working full time on the Rails upgrade. There were engineers at GitHub helping out when they had time, but it was on a volunteer basis. Upgrading Rails was a difficult and lonely task, and I decided there was no way that I would do the 5 series alone. So for the Rails 5 series, I led a team of 4 full-time engineers. By this time, we had learned what processes worked and what didn't. So I used GitHub projects and a tool in RCI to create issues out of all of the unique failures in the build. This prevented duplicate work and made it easy to track progress on the upgrade. Because we had a dedicated team and a streamlined process, the upgrade from 4.2 to 5.2 took only 5 months, and in August of 2018, we deployed Rails 5.2 to production, also with 0 downtime and no customer impact. We learned a lot from the 4.2 upgrade, so we were less nervous about deploying the 5.2. Our test suite is, okay, relatively solid, at least for upgrade purposes, and we had a very clear rollout plan. This was a huge milestone. It was the first time in 10 years that GitHub wasn't on a fork of Rails. It was the first time in 10 years that GitHub was on the most recent version of Rails. That's 10 years of cumulative technical debt from being on a fork, and 10 years of fighting that fork in our application. We had finally started to pay that debt off. By upgrading, we don't eliminate technical debt, but we create breathing room in the application that we hadn't had in a decade. I hope that learning about our upgrade hasn't scared you into not doing your own. The point of this talk isn't to tell horror stories, it's to show you that there's a cost to not upgrading, and that cost is cumulative. After hearing about the Rails upgrade at GitHub, a lot of engineers come to me and ask me how they can convince their leadership team to support an upgrade. They don't have the resources, or it's not in their roadmap, it's not a priority for the company, or they think it'll be too expensive. It's true that upgrading Rails is expensive, and it's time-consuming. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But it's a lot easier to say, this upgrade will need X number of engineers at Y number of dollars for Z number of hours. You can measure that cost and decide whether it's too expensive or not. You can decide if this dollar value is too much for you. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how expensive or how much it actually costs to upgrade your application, because the cost of not upgrading your application is immeasurable. Not upgrading your application will cost you more money than any upgrade because of the debt that will accumulate over time. When you don't upgrade Rails, you have to become a security expert. The Rails core team only supports patching security issues in the major current version and the major versions of the previous version, which means that once 6.0 comes out, we only support 5.0, 5.1, 5.2, and 6.0. Rails 4.2 isn't going to be supported anymore after 6.0 comes out, and there's no grace period, it's just done. So if you're using Rails 4.2 or lower, your team is going to end up being responsible for patching those security vulnerabilities yourself. And it's really hard to get this right, because we try not to reveal how to actually exploit the vulnerability in Rails so that we can protect users who can't upgrade. Not upgrading requires you and your team to actually know how to patch the vulnerability. When you don't upgrade Rails, you lose out on great talent. Bootcamp grads, college grads, people who are changing careers, all kinds of new engineers, maybe someone who's changing from Python to Ruby. They aren't learning Rails 3.2, and they're definitely not learning your weird custom fork. Those engineers not only don't want to work on an old version, they just don't have the knowledge how that version even worked. Engineers will turn down the opportunity to work for you if you're on an old version because that version doesn't let them contribute upstream, it's no longer Googleable, and it's 10 years old. When you don't upgrade Rails, some of the gems you rely on will get abandoned or deprecated, so you'll either have to live with bugs or fork yet another dependency. New gems may not support old versions of Rails, so you won't be able to use those if you're on an old unsupported version. This makes development harder. Every choice that you have in dependency becomes more and more difficult because you're so far behind. Maintaining old gems on top of your old framework is going to get tedious and annoying really quickly. When you don't upgrade Rails, you end up building more and more on top of your fragile application. I've seen this firsthand at GitHub. We have tons of infrastructure code in our app that doesn't belong there. Multiple databases, CI tooling, our own job queue, and things that I probably haven't found yet. Ideally, your application would consist only of code that makes your application do the thing that it's supposed to do. GitHub's value is not in that we have code that makes multiple databases work. Our value is in our community, our issues, our data, our repos. Multiple databases allows us to keep our application up and running, but it is not what customers use our application for. This infrastructure code makes development difficult and more painful because of how tightly it couples your application to the framework. Minor changes can easily turn into massive multi-week refactorings or an abandoned project altogether. But the biggest project of not upgrading Rails is that someday, somebody at your company is going to decide that using Rails is just too expensive and it was a mistake, and that it's time to carve your application up into microservices. Now, this isn't a language war talk, and I'm not criticizing Go or how other people build their apps or services. But we're at a Ruby conference, so I'm going to assume that you at least like writing Ruby. I love writing Ruby. and I want to keep getting paid to write Ruby. It might seem like an exaggeration, but if we don't upgrade Rails, we don't get to keep writing Ruby. The Ruby ecosystem won't improve, our applications will degrade severely, and we'll be faced with an expensive rewrite. Upgrades might cost a lot, but rewrites have a hefty price tag as well. They might even cost you your job. The key to upgrading Rails is to incrementally pay off the cumulative technical debt that you've incurred and figure out a plan to keep that debt paid down. I won't stand here and lie to you and tell you that upgrading Rails will be easy. I'll leave that to the person on Hacker News who wondered why I couldn't do it faster, because they upgraded in a weekend. Clearly, I must just be doing something wrong. The upgrade did take a long time, but it wasn't the only thing that I worked on. I took time to delete unused features, I rewrote our custom test framework, I improved our database handling in development and test. It's unfair for anyone to look at our upgrade timeline and decide that because of that, using Rails is too expensive. We made choices at GitHub that made our upgrade take a long time. You have made choices in your application that will make your upgrade harder. But that doesn't mean that Rails is a bad choice. Technical debt is real, and you and your team need to make decisions about what debt you're willing to put up with. At GitHub, we've decided that being behind Rails master is no longer technical debt that we're willing to put up with. You can slowly work on technical debt and upgrade your Rails application to get it in a better place. There are a few things that you should consider when upgrading, and mistakes to avoid so that you don't end up doing a 2 to 7 year upgrade like we did at GitHub. The most important step is to build a team. Upgrades are difficult, and it helps to have a team that can support each other, bounce ideas off of, and make sure that the momentum keeps up. If you have a one-person upgrade team, and that person leaves your company, your upgrade will be stalled, or maybe even stopped altogether. Make sure to create redundancy and support for such a difficult and important project. If you have a small team and you need to upgrade, consider hiring a contracting firm to help you get out of the weeds. It's going to be expensive, but it's cheaper than not upgrading. They can also help you institute best practices so that you don't end up so far behind in the future. Another thing that makes upgrades easier is taking time to actually plan your upgrade. Your team should ask themselves, do we want to upgrade from 3.2 to 4.0 to 4.1, etc., or do we want to go straight from 3.2 to 5.2? You may want to incrementally upgrade so that you can see all the deprecation warnings, or you may want to just rip the Band-Aid off. Our upgrade was long enough that it made sense to work incrementally so that we had a sense of accomplishment and we could stay motivated. This same process may not make sense for your team. You should also consider whether you want to use a long-running branch or get your application booting in multiple Rails versions. It may not be feasible for you to dual boot the application or add extra CI builds. These are things to consider before you start upgrading because upfront investment may save you time later. You can make your upgrade easier by fixing deprecation warnings early. Instead of ignoring them to take care of the next version, fix them as soon as you see them. Some deprecations are related to major changes, so they can block your application from booting until fixed. One example of this is the alias method change in Rails 5.0. Since it blocks the application from booting, it will stall out your upgrade because only one person will be able to work on it until you get to the actual test failures. Once you're upgraded to the most recent version, make a plan for future upgrades. How often will your team upgrade in the future? Are you willing to test new releases of Rails in the beta or release candidate phase? This helps make upgrades easier because you can tell us on the Rails team what was too hard while you were upgrading on the release candidate. If you can't run Rails master in production, you can invest in a dual booting CI so that you can test Rails 5.2 and 6.0 simultaneously, like we do at GitHub. If you invested in upgrading, it makes sense to also invest in future upgrades so that it's future tooling so that you can keep out of that upgrade debt. So now that we've looked at considerations that you should make when upgrading, we'll now look at things that you should not do because you will regret them. There are a lot of choices that you may make in your application that will make your upgrades harder and make maintaining your application a lot more difficult. Something you're likely to regret in the future is forking Rails. Don't do this. The choice to fork Rails and deviate from upstream was the single most expensive choice we made in regards to our application at GitHub. This had a compounding effect on the state of the code base. That was the reason that our upgrade from 2 to 5 took 7 years. If you absolutely must fork Rails, you should try to at least track upstream as closely as possible and use it only to backport bug fixes or features that you need. If you add features that you never intend to upstream to Rails, your fork will deviate from upstream and upgrading will be more difficult in the future. Another thing that you may regret down the road is falling behind Rails upgrades until the point the Rails team no longer supports your Rails version. If you need to stay on an unsupported version of Rails, you should use Rails long-term support because they'll at least maintain the fork for you and make sure that the security patch is accurate. If you fall behind Rails upgrades and end up writing your own patches, you may do it wrong and leave an unsecure endpoint. In general, the best way to do any security patch is to rely on Rails upstream. Ensuring your application tracks the most recent version of Rails can reduce any surprises when you need to apply that security patch. If you're also using old unsupported gems, your upgrade will be more difficult because you'll be required to upgrade those gems before you can upgrade Rails. So you should ensure that you upgrade your dependencies often so that you can keep in line with Rails requirements. This will also prevent you from ending up using a gem that gets abandoned by its maintainer because we on the Rails team aren't going to keep recommending gems or adding gems that aren't supported. You may also regret using private Rails APIs. In Rails, private APIs are code that's purposely undocumented or under the private namespace. We reserve the right to change these APIs without deprecation, so if your application is relying on the behavior, it can be removed or changed without deprecation. It's always best to use public documented methods in Rails so that you know the Rails team will let you know and warn you if we ever intend to change or remove the behavior. All of these things that we looked at and more can compound the cost of your upgrade. It's easy to see how these decisions cause us to accumulate debt in our applications. I'm hoping by now you're feeling a little bit more confident that you too can do an upgrade. I know it's going to be hard. You might cry. You'll definitely get angry. You may even curse past engineers who no longer work at your company. I definitely did. Sorry to all of you. But I want you to know that you can do it. I have faith in you. You may be thinking like, okay, well, Eileen, maybe it wasn't easy, but you're on the Rails core team and you work at GitHub and I'm just not capable of doing an upgrade. It's too hard and we just don't have the talent. So I'm going to tell you something that I've told a lot of people and they seem surprised by it. And it's not because I want to pat myself on the back, but because I want you to know that you can do this. Before the Rails 3.2 to 5.2 upgrade at GitHub, I had never done a major multi-version upgrade and deployed it to production before. If I can do it, you can do it. I'm not smarter than you, I'm not better than you. Upgrading isn't going to be easy, but especially if you've taken on these cumulative costs that we've looked at. But while you're working on your upgrade, it's important to remember a few things. First, you don't have to solve all of your technical debt problems tomorrow. You can pay debt down incrementally. Start with that class that uses a private Rails API. Remove or document your monkey patches. Identify and upgrade Rails dependencies that are out of date. Rails upgrades are not a sprint, they're a marathon. If you and your team incrementally pay down debt that you've incurred, the upgrade will eventually be possible and completed. I also want you to remember that you're not alone. Many before you have done an upgrade, and many after you will do an upgrade. Find other companies that are doing upgrades at the same time as you and lean on each other for support. When I did the upgrade at GitHub, I knew that Shopify had just finished their Rails upgrade, and I felt comfortable asking the engineers I knew there for advice and support. And lastly, remember that the payoff is worth it. Upgrades take a long time and are difficult, but being afraid of upgrading isn't going to make it go away. When you upgrade your application, it will be in a better place. In addition to better security, easier hiring, and more manageable dependencies, doing the hard work of upgrading will give you improved APIs. Major version upgrades allows the Rails team to rethink how previous features were designed and whether we can improve those in the next version. In Rails 6, an improved API is the handling for multiple databases. Before Rails 6, multiple databases in a Rails application was very painful and awful. You had to write a ton of code yourself, but in Rails 6 we added new APIs for establishing and handling connections, as well as an improved API around active record database configurations. Without upgrading, you don't have access to these improvements. Upgrading to new versions of Rails also improves security. In addition to security upgrades being easier if you're not behind, each Rails version adds new security features to protect your application from bad actors. In Rails 5, we added perform CSRF tokens, Rails 5.2 introduced encrypted secrets, and Rails 6 will ship with improved security around potentially dangerous ARL methods. These features help keep your application secure, and since they're security features and not vulnerability patches, the only way to get them is to upgrade your application. Although Rails 3.0 is plagued with performance issues, newer versions of Rails have focused on better performance. The Rails team is always looking for areas to make Rails faster in all environments, and Rails 6 is shipping with a memory leak fix for view loading and development, and faster active support notifications. Upgrading Rails also gets you access to new libraries. Rails 6 is shipping with brand new frameworks like Action Text and Action Mailbox. I always get this wrong. I can never remember if it's Action Mailbox or Active Box or whatever. There's some mail thing in Rails 6 and it's new. And Zitework, which is our new auto-loading library. By upgrading, you can rely on great new features in Rails without building your own infrastructure tooling into your application. If your application does not is not about sending mail and it just needs to send a mail, it should not have to implement how to send mail. That's on Rails. Rails should take that on for you. Upgrading Rails helps keep that line where Rails ends and your application begins really clear. And lastly, upgrading your application gives you a chance to contribute upstream. It's really difficult to fix bugs, add features, and influence the future of Rails from an old, unsupported version. It's not a requirement to contribute if you're on a new version, but it definitely opens that door that was otherwise closed. As DHH said in 2004 and many times since, frameworks are extracted. We build Rails from our existing needs, but if those needs are set back in Rails 2.3, it's hard to make a case for an extraction GitHub needs. All of these are good reasons to upgrade, but this is the one that kept me going. This is the reason that I spent 1.5 years on the Rails upgrade. It was so that GitHub could influence the future of Rails. For GitHub, this is the biggest and most important reason to upgrade. By upstreaming features, fixing bugs, and supporting Rails' future, we support our future as well. When I look back at the 3.2 to 5.2 upgrade, the thought of being on a modern version of Rails and actively contributing upstream felt like an unachievable fairy tale. We were so far behind that often I wasn't sure we could finish it, at least not without maintaining most of my sanity. But now regularly contributing to Rails and supporting the future of Rails is GitHub's present and future state. Since upgrading Rails, GitHub engineers have set over 75 pull requests that improve performance, fix bugs, and add major functionality to Rails. Before we upgraded, we often were forced to add a monkey patch or work around bugs in overly complex ways. Using Rails 5.2 has allowed us to not just contribute upstream, but to make choices that improve our application instead of hinder it. And all of you here benefit from those changes as well. In addition to bug fixes and performance improvements, we've extracted major functionality from GitHub. We don't have time for technical details, but we extracted our handling for multiple databases in Rails 6. We used our knowledge and expertise on database handling to create an easy-to-use, robust new API for defining, establishing, and switching between databases in your application. We did this extraction not just because it benefits Rails, but because it allows us to reduce complexity in our application. Our goal is to never fall behind again. We're investing in our application and Rails by doing continuous upgrades. Every week we bump our Rails gem and run all of GitHub's tests against that new version. This lets us find regressions in Rails quickly and fix them before we release that new version. It also allows us to test GitHub's code in Rails 5.2 and 6. Since we did the hard work of upgrading major versions, this new process means hopefully that we'll never fall behind. And upgrades will be easy because we're doing them as Rails changes instead of many, many years later. We're confident that Rails 6 is performant, stable, and resilient because of all of this work that we've done. Continuous upgrades and our contributions to Rails are evidence that for the first time in GitHub's history, we're not just using Rails or simply building a Rails application. For the first time in GitHub's history, we're pioneering the future of Rails. We're extracting code from GitHub, building new features into Rails that will help you scale your application, and giving back to open source to support Rails for the long haul. It makes good sense for us to do this. Not only do we give back to the community, but it helps keep our application focused on our product. We can reduce complexity and improve resilience, all while contributing to the future of Rails. At GitHub, we not only need to do this for our application, but we have a responsibility to support Rails. We owe part of our success to the Rails framework, and we have the influence, expertise, and application to push Rails forward. Upgrading Rails was a huge investment. It wasn't cheap, but it was very worth it. Upgrading Rails opens up a ton of possibilities for the future, and we have a bright path ahead of us. We're building features faster, we're more confident our code base is stable, and we're improving the scalability of Rails, all while giving back to the open source community. At a minimum, by upgrading, we went from being crushed by our application, Rails, and the decisions that we made, to building up our application, to building up Rails, to building up our community. Upgrading Rails gave us the freedom and flexibility that we didn't have before. It empowers our engineers to build more and build better. In 2007, GitHub was born, and 11 years later, we're finally tracking master. It took 7 years from the day the 3.0 upgrade was started to the day the 5.2 upgrade was complete. The future is bright, and I can't wait to see what the next 10 years allows us to extract from GitHub, build in Rails, and how the community thrives. At GitHub, we'll continue to contribute to invest in the future of Rails and our community because we have to, because we want to, and because we need to. We'll continue to invest in the future because GitHub and Rails are in it together for the long haul. And I hope you are too. Thank you.